Hello, everyone. Welcome to Module 5. We are finally here. We are at the gut zoomer interpretation, where we get to really look at the stool analysis that you guys all have done. And hopefully that you guys have all received it back, if not very soon. So let's get started. I'm very excited to share this with you because this is what I do every single day. I help people interpret their stool analysis so that you could really get an understanding of why this matters to you. Okay. And how you're going to use this to really support your journey in really achieving optimal health, right? And so let me get to where I needed to go. So this is the summary page of your gut zoomer. And if you look at this section, it's gut diversity, right? So gut diversity is the most important factor in your gut microbiome. It really looks at how many strains of different bacteria do you have living in your gut. Now, the gut zoomer uses a technology, a microchip that tests for or detects microbial DNA. And when you can look at their DNA, you can amplify them with a small segment and then amplify them, replicate them with PCR, and then go in and really look at what bacteria DNA this has come from. And then depending on how much of that DNA is present in the stool sample, that's how they extrapolate the data to really give you the percentages of different bacteria group that represents their presence in your stool. Okay, so in order to understand this, we need to look at the Simpson's index and the Shannon's index. Now, these two are just statistical indices that help us understand population, right? If you look at the Shannon's index, it's going to focus on really it puts a lot of weight on the species richness, like how much of them are in that population from the scale of 0 to 3. The higher the number, the more diversity. Less than 1.5 is extremely low diversity, and anything greater than 2.5 is good diversity. On the other hand, you have Simpson's index. This index places a greater weight on species evenness. How evenly distributed are that strain of bacteria is present among the population living in your gut. This takes into account the number of species present, as well as the relative abundance of each species. So it's on a scale of 0 to 1. The lower the number, the less diversity. So a score of, say, 0.5 means that there is a 15% probability that if you pick two species in a sample at random, they will be different. This is low diversity, meaning that there is one species dominating the population. So it gives more weight to the dominant species. Random or rare species won't have as much influence. So that's why you have to know how to use both index. But in general, what you need to know is what each one of these are. And you want to aim for, of course, higher diversity on the scale. Now, to the right, you're going to see the phylum. The phyla is a taxonomy classification of the bacteria kingdom, right? So it has the phylum, then you have the which basically are big groups of bacteria, and there are different genus and species under these phylum. But in general, what you want to understand here is Bacteroidetes. These are considered the good bacteria population in our gut. And usually they represent about 50 to 60% of the gut microbiome. On the next group that you want to pay attention to is the Firmicutes. Now, Firmicutes are mainly the Clostridia, Bacilli, and Negativicute. They're mostly considered bad bacteria, but not all bacteria in this group is bad, but the majority of them are. They can also be considered opportunistic bacteria, meaning that at low number, they don't really cause any problem. They're actually critical to the function of the gut microbiome, but to But if they overgrow, that's when they become opportunistic bacteria that can cause disease, right? And we're going to go deeper into these a little bit later. But firmicutes usually are about 40 to 50%. So if you see that in this sample right here, that there is a 53.9%, and that is way higher than the Bacteroidetes. This is one of the most major dysbiosis in the gut that you can have. And it's represented by this key ratio. You can see firmicutes to Bacteroidetes. So you want this ratio to be less than 0.9. So if anything is higher, that means you have a little bit more too much bad bacteria compared to good bacteria. Proteobacteria are bacteria that produces this very toxic gas. And in general, if they are around 5%, they don't cause any problem. They do contribute to the overall health of the microbiome. But when you see them overgrowing greater than 5-6%, that's when you have bacterial overgrowth. There is actinobacteria. Actually, these are gram-positive bacteria. So usually these are pretty abundant in the gut microbiome, and some of them are bad, some of them are good. Like there's nothing that's definitively bad or definitively good in the gut microbiome. It's all about the balance and how much diversity of different species that are there in your gut microbiome and how they interact with each other. Okay. And then you have archaea bacteria or Euarchaeota bacteria. These are ancient bacteria. They're not true bacteria anymore, but they only represent really one class of bacteria, which is Methanobrevibacter smithii. And we're going to go into that in a little bit too. But those guys produce methane. So methane gas. So very little amount is okay, but when you have an overgrowth of these guys, you're going to have a lot of dysfunction. And then you have Variocomicrobia. These guys are your main, it's actually the most important bacteria group in the microbiome, which is Akkermansia mucinifera. All right. And then you have, so these guys you want a lot of, right? And then you have fusobacteria. So fusobacteria and bacteria can cause a number of diseases and infections in human, including periodontal disease, Lemire syndrome, and colorectal cancer. So in general, you don't want a lot of these in your microbiome. And when there is a high level, that's the stuff that we need to look into is these conditions. There's another key ratio here that you see, Prevotella and Bacteroid. So Prevotella in general are bacteria that feed on fiber. So when you have a abnormal ratio here, typically is due to an imbalance of fiber consumption and meat and processed foods or other foods consumption. So in general, you want this ratio to be greater than 0.47. And if it's low, I can tell from the lab that this person doesn't really consume a lot of fiber and plant-based food. Okay. Now, there are different relationships that the gut microbiome has with the rest of our body systems. So there is a condition called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which you see here. Now, this test do not diagnose SIBO, because you need a breath test to do that. But in general, because I've done this so much, I don't need to do the breath test anymore, but I can look at the stool test and see which type of bacterial overgrowth you're dealing with. Pretty much that's what you need to know about SIBO. Now, SIBO is usually about 30 to 40% of the cases will have small intestinal fungal overgrowth associated with it. And this condition is when you have really bad bloating, especially after eating fiber. So unfortunately, when you have bacterial overgrowth and you consume fiber, the fiber actually can cause a lot of symptoms of heartburn, bloating, indigestion, gas that are really painful. Typically, this condition, depending on what types of gas are being produced in the gut, you can have hydrogen gas, which is the least toxic. And again, a lot of discomfort after eating, a lot of bloating, but not as severe as methane gas type. So methane gas type is produced by the Uri archaea bacteria, which is the Methanobrevibacter smithii. Now, methane gas is toxic to us. So when you have bacteria that is overproducing this methane gas, you can imagine it's painful, it's very uncomfortable, lots of inflammation. You start, one of the symptoms is rosacea, right? Skin condition, like breakouts, a lot of eczema, and brain fog is really bad with this type of gas. And then the most severe form of SIBO is hydrogen sulfide gas, which smells rarely, but a lot of time because it smells like sulfur. So the gas, when the person passes it, it smells like rotten egg. Now that is a very rare incident, but when it happens, it's very indicative of hydrogen sulfide bacteria overgrowth. And then you can see here, there's neurological health. This is, there are certain bacteria that when they overgrow or when they are present, they are associated with Alzheimer's, autism's, or Parkinson's disease. Some of them are associated with anxiety and depression, but anxiety and depression are more related to just really like the whole population of bacteria that's living in the gut. There's also intestinal permeability. This is when you have increased intestinal permeability is leaky gut, where there's too much things leaking into the bloodstream versus being absorbed into the bloodstream. So there's like a compromised gut lining integrity. And this causes a lot of inflammation, also causes eczema, psoriasis, and increased intestinal permeability is the main root cause of all the chronic diseases that we deal with. It is the root cause of autoimmune disease, and it causes a lot of immune dysfunction. And so this is one of those things you have to treat properly in order to allow your body to heal and decrease inflammatory response in the system. And so this is where we start if you're going to treat the gut, right? And then there's metabolic health. The lack of, let's say, Akkermansia growth. If you have a deficiency of Akkermansia, you're going to have an increased risk of obesity and diabetes or insulin resistance. And it's highly studied in the literature, in the microbiome world. And that's what we've been finding. And that's why Akkermansia is the most important keystone species in the gut. And unfortunately, the general population now, most of us have very low level of Akkermansia, including myself. And then there's liver health. There are bacteria that produce just so much toxic gases and waste products that when it gets to the liver, because most of this, everything that's in the gut, when it gets absorbed, it goes to the liver first so that the liver can filter out all the toxins before it sends everything to the systemic flow and systemic circulation. And then there's hormones. So the gut has a lot of function. One of them is regulating how you eliminate estrogen and testosterone, right? And then there's also bacteria that are associated with autoimmune disease, IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome, cardiovascular health. There are bacteria associated with this. So depending on what your scores say, so this is a score out of 6. Anything greater than 6 is just gonna be I guess there's no value. They just say greater than 6. Anything in the red means that there is a strong association. So that's how it just makes this easier for you as the patient to understand the data. But I use this just to kind of like briefly look at, okay, what do I need to focus on for this patient? It doesn't really tell you the whole story. Okay, let's get into this. Now, the way they have this is that in the report, if you have an abnormal marker, they will list those first. And then they will give you a description of what it means to have these abnormal level. So here, for instance, beta defensin 2. This is a peptide, it's a protein that is regulated by inflammation. And it is produced by epithelial cells in the gut lining, and it has antimicrobial activity against gram-negative bacteria and yeast, candida, but not gram-positive bacteria. So when it is high, you can extrapolate the data and say that there is an overgrowth of gram-negative bacteria or candida overgrowth. So it's a measure of bacteria overgrowth from gram-negative bacteria and yeast. And then you see fecal S100A12. This marker is a kind of a newer marker, mostly studied in children so far, but we have seen the data that it's correlated with inflammatory bowel disease, which is ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And it helps you distinguish between IBS and IBD. I'm just sharing this with you so you can understand that there is explanation here, that if your whatever is positive for you, they will give an explanation. So is the digestive and absorption markers. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to all the section where it's indicating, like it shows everything that is tested for. Then I'm going to go over each of these markers and tell you the significance of them, so that you can understand how it applies to you. Okay, so we're going to first look at the inflammation markers. Now, the innate immune system of the gut plays a very important role in maintaining a fine balance between commensal bacteria, which is the bacteria that's supposed to live in our gut, that is in our ecosystem, and the immune system responds to potential pathogens, meaning these are organisms that can cause disease, cause inflammation. So it is a very complex system comprised of multiple components, including the mechanobarriers, the antimicrobial peptides that we produce to protect ourselves, inflammatory proteins produced by the cells that are the immune cells or the epithelial cells that are in that area, and then microbial products, right? Like we're measuring waste products or byproducts from the bacteria as well. And dysfunction of any of these components can lead to the development of intestinal disease. Now, the first thing, I'm just going to review some stuff here, is the mechanical barriers of the gut is the mucus layer, right? That's the mucus layer that coats the lining of the gut. Now, what's really cool is that this mucus layer, we produce them. So when there's an increased exposure to things that are causing inflammation to us or things that we want to protect ourselves from, we actually will produce extra mucus. That's why when you have parasitic infection, you have a lot of mucus. And there's also, so this mucus layer is why it's the reason why Akkermansia is the most important species in the gut, is that Akkermansia actually eat the mucus. So the whole name for Akkermansia is Akkermansia mucinifila. Mucin is mucus, phila is love. So they love mucus. And they actually eat up this, the mucus layer, which is usually trapped, is full of toxins, food particles, environmental toxins. So that's our protective layer, and Akkermansia is the workforce that really go in and clean up the waste for us. Now, what's really what you want to know here is that because of our lifestyle of overeating, eating too frequently, eating too many meals, snacking throughout the day, Akkermansia cannot go out to work, because if you're eating, then the gut is working and it's not resting time. So Akkermansia can't go out and clean up and do their thing. So Akkermansia is more functional during times of fasting. That's why prolonged fasting or even intermittent fasting is so beneficial to us, is because it allows Akkermansia to go to work and clean up our gut microbiome, the mucus layer. But in that process, so they eat our waste, right, toxins, but then they produce waste products that are beneficial to us. Isn't that amazing? It's just such a beautiful relationship that we have with these microbes. But my goal and intention in sharing this with you is that for you to really embrace this beautiful connection, this beautiful relationship, and harness and modify your lifestyle so that you can harness the power of these organisms as a function, right? So some of the ways to increase akkermansia is fasting, intermittent fasting, 16 hours or more, or prolonged fasting. But you can also feed yourself blueberries, blackberries, any food that is dark blue, dark purple, blackish will also feed the akkermansia population. So I just want to share that with you because I always thought that was so cool. The other mechanical barriers that we have is the intestinal epithelial cell wall and tight junctions, which we are going to look at some markers that can indicate the damages to these barriers of tight junctions, right? And then we also produce enzymes. So now these enzymes is what you're going to see here in the inflammation markers. So you see the defensins, which is beta defensin 2, is a subtype, right? And then lactoferrin. Lactoferrin is iron, so it's you could see that it's related to iron. And lysozyme is an enzyme produced by neutrophils. I'm going to go into them a little bit more, but I just want to classify these for you. And then there are inflammatory proteins, calprotectin, and then S100 A12, and then you have microbes and microbial products, which are really down here with your metabolites, which is your short chain fatty acids. Now, let's really go in and look at these inflammation markers a little closer. So to understand this, I want to introduce the concept of antimicrobial peptide, or known as AMPs. Okay, so these AMPs are broad spectrum innate antibiotics, meaning that we produce them ourselves. We produce them within the intestinal epithelial cells. Those are the cells that line the gut lining, right? As well as circulating inflammatory cells, particularly neutrophils. So they produce this, and these AMPs play a role in maintaining balance and homeostasis in the GI microbial ecosystem. So AMPs have antimicrobial activity. They regulate the number and the composition of commensal bacteria, meaning that when these bacteria overgrow, they will, the neutrophils will release these AMPs to help regulate the overgrowth and bring them down. AMPs are also thought to be an ancient defense system that play a significant role in our co-evolution with our complex microbiome. Okay, now the inflammatory markers that are measured, the number one is calprotectin. So how we use this is really it's produced by neutrophils. And so neutrophils, if their function, they are a type of immune cells that pretty much kill bacteria. That's their main job. They, inside neutrophils, have bleach, hydrochloric acid, which is very strong. You know, the pH of hydrochloric acid is around 2, which is very strong enough to kill any bacteria, right? So when there is a infiltration, it's not truly an infection, okay? An infiltration of bacteria in our gut lining, neutrophils will be recruited, because when it's infiltrating, the epithelial cells in the gut will know that it's being infiltrated, so it will release cytokines, like these chemical compounds that's pretty much recruit the neutrophils in the bloodstream, or the ones that are just kind of laying around, to come to that site and then release massive amount of calprotectin so that it will kill the bacteria. So this marker is elevated in patients that have ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. It's also seen in colon cancer, and it's also seen in NSAID, enteropathy, or diseases that comes from using NSAID, okay, which is Advil, ibuprofen, pain medications, meloxicam, what are some other, but basically the ones that we use for joint pain, those are the ones that actually cause leaky gut. It damages the gut lining. It is known to cause gastritis. It also causes kidney disease. It injures kidney the cells in the kidneys and the filtration system in the kidneys. So this marker is really sensitive, but it's not specific. So, but it is a marker used to measure, to really as a diagnostic workup for inflammatory bowel disease, but also to track treatment and how well the patient is doing. Okay, so now you want to look at lactoferrin. So lactoferrin is an iron-binding protein, and it is an antimicrobial peptide, an AMP, located within neutrophils as well, and is released in the presence of inflammation or dysbiosis. So when you have too much of the bad bacteria population, you can have high level of lactoferrin, especially when the level reach a critical threshold where there's just way too much of bacteria overgrowth. It can sequester iron, thus deprive these bacteria from iron. This is another cool thing about our the human system, is that we can hide iron from these bacteria, which they need to survive, right? So this is one of our protective mechanism. And so when this marker is high, it's an indicator that there is an active infiltration of bacteria overgrowth or dysbiosis. And so your neutrophils are trying to protect you. This one can act on both gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, and it is widely accepted that lactoferrin has an antiviral, antifungal, and antiparasitic function. And then this marker is usually elevated in Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, and is usually negative in IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. So this is a marker that you can use to differentiate between the severe form of inflammatory bowel disease, which has ulcers. So when this is present, you think there's ulcer somewhere. So typically, I guess the gold standard and recommendation on what to do is get a colonoscopy. But to me, this is enough to let me know that you have ulcers. So instead of spending the time going through the stressor, but also drinking that toxic solution to go get a colonoscopy, I don't recommend that. I like to be a little bit more conservative in my workup to diagnose something, because to me, if I look at this and I know what's going on in the system, treat it and retest, and you don't have to follow up with those unnecessary. I think sometimes it's overused, and I don't think it has that much value, because you can only visually see what's on the surface of the lining. And to me, the other factor is when you get a colonoscopy and you have ulcers, you get diagnosis, and then you either get a drug, so you get treated with medication, versus if you understand this, you can now go and do lifestyle modification. You could use probiotics, like herbal protocols or targeted supplementation to help you deal with these kind of inflammation. But essentially, it's just getting rid of the bacteria overgrowth or infection, parasites, right? If you treat those, these things will really come back to normal, right? Okay, beta defensin 2. This is another AMP, so it's antimicrobial peptide expressed in the epithelial cells. So this is in the cells that line the lining of the gut. It has a potent antimicrobial activity against gram-negative bacteria, so I mentioned that earlier, and candida, but not gram-positive. So you can tell by just these markers that, oh, you have a gram-negative problem. So that usually is going to point to the bad bacteria population, right? And then candida, you just have to treat candida. And then, so in my slides, I'm also going to post the slides for all of these so that you can get like the actual text for all these explanation. I have different intervention, but those are just really like standard. What you really need to do when you see these markers is treat parasites, bacteria overgrowth, or bacterial infection, or yeast. right? Those are the main things, unless you have pathogens that show up later, which you have to treat those. And everything else, probiotics, prebiotics, and all these other supplements that you see, like glutamine, they don't work until you treat the root cause. Or they work better if you co-use it while you're treating or killing off the infections, the overgrowth, or the parasite infection, right? So that's why a lot of times when you just take random supplements, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But in general, supplementation will only still treat symptoms. They cover up the symptoms. You have to eat really clean in order to manage your symptoms, but you will not, but if you get off course, your symptoms will come back. That's why treating the root cause is really important. Okay. All right. Lysozyme is an enzyme secreted by granulocytes. So granulocytes are neutrophils, which fight bacteria, eosinophils, which fight parasites, and basophils, which fight pretty much everything. Now, these granulocytes, they're very specialized cells in that it can kill the organisms because they all contain, like, so neutrophils contain bleach, eosinophils contain histamine, okay? And then basophils contain other enzymes that break down the organism and kill down. So it says here, breaks down the cell wall of certain gram-negative positive bacteria. It is a marker more specific for inflammation in the colon versus the small intestine. So when you have a very high level of lysozyme, it is a it is commonly associated with significant overgrowth of yeast or dysbiotic bacteria. And if it's really high, then it's then identified as ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, as well as non-inflammatory bowel disease, GI disease, like with diarrhea. This is what the data says when compared to healthy controls. Okay. S100, this is a protein similar to calprotectin, is produced by neutrophils as well. Again, it is seen in ulcerative colitis and Crohn's. Just think ulcers, right? And it's particularly important in children because this marker is used to distinguish IBS from IBD in children. And then MMP9, this is the matrix metalloprotease 9. It is significantly increased in the stool of people with ulcerative colitis compared to healthy people or patients with IBS. This is a repair enzyme, and it gets upregulated when there is GI damage. So when there is ulceration, that's really significant GI damage. This marker is correlated with clinical and endoscopic activity with ulcerative colitis. It is useful in diagnosis of diuretic diseases, diarrhea, right, disorders, and in non-invasive evaluation of disease activity and mucosal healing in ulcerative colitis. All right, this is my favorite marker. This is eosinophil protein X. It is a water-soluble protein that is found in eosinophils. EPX levels in stool are marker of eosinophil activity. Eosinophils usually are very low in their existence. We don't make a lot of them, and we only make them when we have parasites. Now, a lot of the research suggests that EPX is correlated with food allergy. But if you really look at it, food allergy comes from having parasitic infection. And because if you have, the more parasites you have, the more I would say the more reactivity you have to food because of the high eosinophil protein X. So that's been my experience. The data that is kind of you would see out there is that it's associated with or it suggests food allergy, but I think it's really more parasitic. Okay, so the potential risk mitigation choices to lower intestinal inflammation is going to come down to what food you eat, if you know how to use functional food and phytonutrients, and lifestyle, sleeping, moving, right? Fasting. Those are things that can really help you decrease inflammation. But like I said earlier, you got to treat the root cause. Okay, now we're going to move on to markers of maldigestion and malabsorption. So pancreatic elastase is an enzyme produced by the exocrine tissue in the pancreas. Now, the pancreas has two functions: exocrine function, which produces enzymes, and an endocrine function, which produces hormone, namely insulin and glucagon, which regulate our blood sugar. Now, fecal pancreatic elastase is a marker that is broken down in the digestive tract and can be measured in the stool when you have normal pancreatic function. The level in the stool is decreased when you have a decrease in elastase producing. Now, elastase can, how do I say, measure of elastase can tell you how well you're producing amylase and lipase as well. So if elastase is low, you can extrapolate that data to say that your amylase and your lipase is also low. Those are the two enzymes that the pancreas produce to help you digest starch, carbs. Okay. And so if you have low pancreatic elastase, it indicates a couple of things. One is that you can't digest your carbs properly and extract nutrients from them. The second thing is that it indicates stress. It's a huge stressor. If your pancreas is not working properly, there is either parasites or a lot of toxicity in your system that interferes with the way the pancreas function. The pancreas is also considered like a fatty tissue, so it's going to hold on to fat-soluble toxins. And so and then alcohol can get stored in there too, particularly ethylene alcohol, which is a cleaning product that contaminates a lot of the food that we eat that are processed, like salad dressing, anything that has to pass through like cheese that are made in a mass produced, right? Or anything that is produced in a big stainless steel container that requires cleaning, you can get exposure to those toxins that would then kind of gravitate towards the pancreas and cause dysfunction. So you also see here that there are meat fiber and vegetable fiber. So if your test shows that it's detected, that means that the stool has meat fiber that wasn't broken down properly. So that is an indicator that you don't have enough stomach acid that breaks down all the meat in the stomach. So digestion, if you remember from our first module, digestion of protein takes place in the stomach where there's a lot of stomach acid. And then digestion of fat happens when the food enters the small intestine, and then bile gets released, and then the bile emulsify the fat, and then you absorb the fat in the small intestine. And then starches are also digested in the small intestine as well. Now, there's also fat malabsorption, as you can see here. There's different types of fat in our diet. And if you are not absorbing some of these fat, then you are going to have issues with fat-soluble vitamin absorption, which is vitamin A, D, E, and K. And they need fat to get absorbed. But if you have issues with absorbing fat, you're not absorbing them either. So then the thing to do here is follow up with a test. You could do a blood test. I find that micronutrient testing, you got to know to test for serum and cellular, and not all of them have cellular testing. So it's tricky. So you just got to know what to test for when you look for these. Now, not all fats are good, particularly triglycerides. So sometimes I see patients that have very low triglyceride, which is fat that comes from animal products, bad seed oil, bad oils, vegetable oils, and junk food. And if they can't absorb triglyceride, their serum or their blood cholesterol or their blood triglyceride level can be low. So sometimes it's beneficial, but most of the time it's not. And then phospholipids, for instance, is one of the fats that you really want a lot of, because we use phospholipids to make our cell membrane. And when you can't absorb phospholipids, your cell membrane are pretty weak. They break easily, they're damaged easily. So that's why fat absorption is so important. And then cholesterol is absorbed so that we can make hormones. We need cholesterol to make hormones. And about 30–40% of the cholesterol that we get in our system is from food that we absorb, but our liver also makes cholesterol. And that is where cholesterol gets a little bit complex. Maybe I can go into that in another course. And then bile acid metabolites is another section that we can look at. Now, bile acid metabolites, this is really important because cholic acid and phenyldeoxycholic acid, these are what you consider primary bile. And these are important for digestion and absorption of fat and fat-soluble vitamins. Okay, so this is the bile that gets released in the liver, stored in the gallbladder, and then released once we eat something fatty, your gallbladder will release, right? Now, it emulsifies the fat because it has like a detergent-like property. And then it helps break down the fat into globules and tiny droplets so you can absorb them. And it also transports lipids in aqueous environment, which is like water environment. And this is important because you can't really, like, fat doesn't mix well with water, right? So that's why you have to transport them. And this is why the bile function is so important. So with the cholic acid and the phenyldeoxycholic acid, or CDCA, they can indicate if they're abnormal. If you have high level of them, that means typically you may have a liver problem that is due to a genetic mutation that pretty much can't break down the bile acid properly. So abnormal levels of these the CA and the CDCA can lead to liver damage and other health issues. And they are usually due to genetic defect in the bile acid production. I think out of all the tests, which is hundreds of these, I've only seen 1 or 2 people with an abnormal cholic acid level. Now, elevated levels of these two are associated with conditions like cholestatic liver disease, meaning that you can't release bile, so you can't detox properly. And when you can't detox properly, your liver gets damaged from the buildup of these bile. And then there is also lithocholic acid and deoxycholic acid. These two metabolites are actually considered abnormal bile acid metabolites because they're classified as secondary bile acids, meaning that they are produced by the bacteria in the gut through modification of the primary bile acids. And the elevated levels of these secondary bile acids can be associated with different diseases, particularly colorectal cancer. So when you see abnormality in these two markers and their ratio, you have to look at cancer. Okay. I think I have one patient that I found and diagnosed, or not diagnosed, but we got to look into it early. We did a colonoscopy. We found polyps. They were removed. So it was that person was able to resolve this because we detected it pretty early. Okay. What else do I want to say? Well, the impact of these two is that they are more hydrophobic. That means they work better in lipophilic. So that means they can penetrate fatty tissue better. So that means they can penetrate our cells better because our cell membrane are fatty, right? So usually they can penetrate and cause intestinal cell damage. So the high level of these two markers is, like I said, it's significantly associated with colorectal cancer, and it promotes cell proliferation. It inhibits apoptosis or cell death and induce inflammation in the colon. Okay. I think covered that. So another thing you want to consider here is uh learning how to interpret this is when you see elevated of the secondary bile acids in the colon or the stool, there's other things that they are associated with clinically, which is increased oxidative stress, which is like rusting of the cell, right? DNA damage, right? Impaired gallbladder function, gallstone formation, colonic inflammation, and increased intestinal permeability or leaky gut. Okay. Um, I'm trying to really see how I can simply tell you guys how to address this, but there is really no simple way. Usually, if you have abnormal bile acid metabolites, you definitely need to work with someone one-on-one. It wouldn't really, it's not something that you can manage on your own. So I'm going to skip over how to really look at that so I can go into the short chain fatty acids metabolite. Now, this is the most important piece in the gut microbiome. This is the main reason why we take probiotics, why we want the good bacteria in our gut microbiome is because they produce these short chain fatty acids. Now, they're fat, right? Fatty acids. The bacteria in our gut, there are a very specific group of them that can convert the fiber that you eat into fat. We can't do that. We cannot convert fiber into fat, but the bacteria can. That's why we need them. That's why they are part of our ecosystem. And these guys, these short chain fatty acids, the way you want to look at them is that they have to be in the right percentage. You need to have them represent in the right percentage, and the total short chain fatty acids has to be around 200 for it to be optimal. And then of that 200, they need to be in the appropriate percentages for each of the metabolite. The only one that you can't really, actually, the only one that you can supplement with is butyrate. Everything else, the process of making them is so complex that you can't really produce them out in like real life. It's the condition that is needed for these other metabolites or these other short chain fatty acids to be made it requires the environment in the gut. And you really don't want to mess with those. But butyrate has been studied and has been shown to be the most important short chain fatty acids in the gut because it regulates our immune system. It recruits Treg cells, which are the immune cells that really has a lot of control over like inflammation and reactivity to what's going on in the gut. And then butyrate also provides cellular energy to the cells that live in the gut, colonocyte and enterocytes. And then they also repair, they help you repair the gut lining. When you have leaky gut, you need butyrate to repair it. So if you are low in butyrate, you definitely need to supplement. And a lot of times you have to supplement up to 8 weeks for you to really see the benefits. All right, let's go to these other markers. Now, this is going to start to get more interesting, okay? Okay. Let me see if I forgot something here. Just to quickly, going back to the short chain fatty acids, the causes of slow short chain fatty acids are diarrhea because of the rapid transit leading to decreased short chain fatty acid production. Constipation can lead to increased short chain fatty acid absorption. And then inflammation, particularly ones that is high in calprotectin. Chronic antibiotic use can decrease short-chain fatty acids, decrease carbohydrate and fiber consumption. So these are really deficient in people who consume a lot of meat and a lot of processed food and not enough fiber. And then severe dysbiosis can cause this. And there's in the slides that I'm going to give you, there are therapeutic steps to increase short chain fatty acids that you can look over. And it's going to list the group of bacteria that are producers of butyrate and these short chain fatty acids. And then you can look at those and then and there's at the end of the slides, you're going to see a guide on how to increase different fiber to diversify your gut microbiome. Because I think there's just too much information for me to cover in here. But I wanted to really just give you guys like the best and the most important information. Now, to increase dietary butyrate, you can consider the supplementation like I shared with you, or you can consume ghee or grass-fed butter. Ghee is clarified butter where they take out all like the dairy component, and raw milk. Butter is about 3 to 4% butyrate, so about 10 grams or 2 tablespoons of butter daily would equal about 300 milligrams of butyrate, which is a lot. But obviously you don't want to consume too much butter, but I think 2 tablespoons a day or every other day is pretty good. And then you can supplement with butyrate salts. We're going to put together a supplemental protocol that help you address all of these, and you're going to have an option to purchase some of these supplements that I use because I actually can't take butter. Like, even though I know it's high in butyrate, but I can't eat butter because I have reaction to dairy if I eat too much. So it's not something I can eat every day, but it's something I can eat like maybe once a week or once a month. So then I use supplementation because it just works better for me. And then some herbal medicines can also increase short chain fatty acids, such as berberine. That's why berberine is so good for blood sugar regulation, anti-inflammation, but also restoring gut microbiome balance as well. Chinese yam, lotus seed, resistant starch, and some species of mushroom can help you increase short chain fatty acids as well. All right, so now we're gonna go over to the other markers. The first one is beta glucuronidase. So there's actually a lot of information on this, but I'm just going to narrow it down to what you need to know. So basically, this enzyme is produced by anaerobic bacteria, pretty much the Clostridia, Ruminococciae, the Escherichia, which is like the family of genus of E. coli, and Shigella families of bacteria, which can be overexpressed during dysbiosis. So when these organisms, when they overgrow, Clostridia is a family of bacteria that often are overgrowing in our gut microbiome. So then you can have an overproduction of this enzyme, and this enzyme, it cuts the bond that keeps the estrogen waste in the gut. It keeps it there's a protein that binds to the estrogen waste that when you release bile, you get rid of estrogen as well. So in general, testosterone gets converted to estrogen, and then estrogen get broken down into like its metabolites that are water soluble, and then you eliminate into the bile and through the stool. Some of it goes through the urine, but essentially this enzyme beta glucuronidase can break that bond, making the estrogen free, or the waste estrogen free, and now it's reabsorbable. So this is really important because you just, well, not you, but like when the presence of this enzyme is there, it's going to interfere with how much you can eliminate waste estrogen. So you can actually have estrogen dominance if you have high level of beta glucuronidase. And in men, it has an impact because it affects the hormone balance between estrogen and testosterone. And in women, it may cause us to have a lot of issues with our menstrual cycle, heavy bleeding, cramping, moodiness, a lot of anxiety even, and mood instability, right? And they're up to date. There are about 600 bacteria, genera, and species that colonize our gut that can produce this beta glucuronidase. And the gut zoomer actually measures all 60 of these species. Okay. Ultimately, let me just show you another picture here so you can see this, because I think pictures is worth so much more. Okay, so in a normal healthy beta glucuronidase level, you have the ovaries produce estrogen, and it goes through the body, it goes through the liver, then you eliminate it through the gut. Most of the estrogen get out, and some estrogen get back in. But when you have too much or high level of beta glucuronidase, then you have some estrogen get out and most estrogen will get back in. So the concept is that you end up having too much estrogen, right? Which is what you don't want. No, this is not what I want to see here. This one. Okay. The next marker I want to discuss is the secretory IgA. This is a primary antibody that protects us from pathogens and toxins that penetrate the mucosal surfaces. So the mucus layer that lines the intestinal wall is rich in SIgA. And these SIgA, they're so cool because pretty much when there's a bacteria, these IgA will bind to the bacteria and cover them up so that they cannot stick to our intestinal wall. And then so it pretty much neutralizes their ability to infect us or to cause damage to our wall lining. It also binds to food particles. So when you eat food and the food particle is large, right? When you don't digest it well enough, it becomes large. And then when you have leaky gut, these food particles can leak into your bloodstream. And then there's an immune system that pretty much recognize it as a foreign invader because as a food, you shouldn't be here. You should only be absorbed as nutrients, like amino acids or the vitamins or the minerals that are extracted from the food gets in, not the food particle itself. Now, this is important for you to understand because this is how food sensitivity, food allergies get developed, is that when we don't have enough IgA to neutralize these food particles, and then these food particles somehow get into our bloodstream, you now basically is the start of the immune system now recognizing this as a foreign invader. It tags it, create memory cells on this and say, this is a foreign invader. The next time we see this, we're going to automatically attack them. This is how food sensitivity gets developed and food allergies as well, but it's also the beginning of autoimmune disease development. So people with high IgA, so the level is high, that's an indicator that there is a lot of bacteria, food particles that are activating your immune system to produce IgA. It is easy to treat. When this is low, there's two possibilities. One is that there is something suppressing the immune system. Your immune system is now weak and it cannot produce IgA. Typically mold, drugs that suppress your immune system will do this. But then the other is that chronic inflammation in the gut where your immune system just get exhausted, where it just can't produce any more, it doesn't have any more energy left, or just have nothing left in them. So then they end up not producing enough IgA to protect our gut anymore. Okay, so fecal occult blood, pretty straightforward. Occult is hidden. So if blood is shown up on here, it is not diagnostic for colon cancer, but it is used for clinical screening. So I use this as a screening tool for patients. So if you do this every year, or just a stool, a fecal occult blood test can replace the colonoscopy for those of you who don't want to get a colonoscopy when you get to that age. Okay, fecal pH test for the acidity in the stool, and it's average around 6.6, but the range is about 6.4 to 7.4. Now, acidic stool is suggestive of a digestive problem such as lactose intolerance, pathogen infections like E. coli or rotavirus, or an overgrowth of acid-producing bacteria such as lactic acid producing bacteria. And then a high alkaline pH, which means it's alkalinic, is associated with the body's inability to produce enough acid along with undigested food. So acid reflux, GERD, those are conditions where you are not producing enough stomach acid to digest your protein. And so the acid doesn't go through the digestive system, and then your stool end up being alkalinic, right? And when you don't have enough acidity, you can't break down protein. So there's a lot of implications of an abnormal fecal pH. A lot of times I don't see the abnormality in fecal pH. It's not a common thing that shows up, but it is something to know about and to consider. Okay, factors that influence fecal pH is bacterial dysbiosis, PPIs or proton pumps inhibitors, which cause dysbiosis, which then alters the pH. Low stomach acid production, H. pylori infection. So H. pylori will decrease stomach acid production because it wants to stay alive. It doesn't want you to produce stomach acid, which then will kill it, right? Maldigestion and malabsorption, SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Transit time, rapid transit time lowers pH. Slow transit time, which is like constipation, raises pH. And then osmotic laxatives. So if you take laxatives, that's going to cause that too, or excess dietary fat or protein, or an insufficient dietary plant-based fiber can alter the pH. Okay, now let's look at fecal zonulin. So fecal zonulin is a protein that is basically binds to all the cells in between the, let me show you a picture. I like to show a picture. It just makes so much more sense. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in here. So these are epithelial cells, right? And in between are these proteins that hold them together. And these proteins are flexible. They're like gates. They serve as a channel. So they open up to let nutrients in, and then they may open up to let waste out too. But most of the time is to get nutrients in. Well, when there's damage to the gut lining, these zonulin proteins will be broken, and then they spill out into the bloodstream, into the stool, and that's how you pick it up, right? So when you see an elevated level of zonulin, you can deduce that there's a lot of epithelial cell damages and the proteins are spilling out. When you have fecal anti-gliadin antibody shows up, this is another marker that tests for leaky gut, like zonulin. That's a marker for leaky gut. These two markers, when they're high, you can tell that you have leaky gut, and then anti-gliadin indicates that your immune system is reacting to gliadin, which is a protein in wheat, very closely related to gluten. And so you can deduce that you have a gluten sensitivity when there's anti-gliadin present in your stool test. Okay, so we just went over a lot, right? But this is how cool this gut zoomer is. It is the most comprehensive test or stool analysis on the market that I've seen. I've used all of the stool testing out there from different companies, but this one is the easiest one to use because they also give you explanation for patients to read. So I like that so that people can understand it. And it gives you so much more data than all the other stool tests. And they cost a little bit more than the other tests, but it gives you a more comprehensive look at your microbiome. And it is the only stool analysis that will give you all of the bacteria, about 170 bacteria are tested that have been identified by them, by their microchip technology. So when you look at these, you really got to look at the main group of bacteria, the family, and then you look at the keystone species. I'm going to go through and I'm going to point out all the main family and the main keystone species. So when you see a bacteria name with a minus sign, that means those are gram-negative bacteria. So the difference in gram-negative bacteria and gram-positive bacteria is that gram-negative bacteria don't have a cell membrane. And instead, they have endotoxins called lipopolysaccharides, which mean they're made out of fat, lipo, lots of fat, and saccharides, the sugar. So it's a chain of fat and sugar that is highly toxic and inflammatory to us. So when we have leaky gut and these bacteria endotoxins, get into our system, that's what causes the massive amount of inflammation in the gut. Now, one of the signs that you can tell is that if you eat a meal, especially a fatty meal, like during lunch, and you're doing something where you're not really active and you're just sitting around, you're gonna feel extremely fatigued, and then you want to take a nap. That's a pretty hallmark sign of leaky gut. Sometimes that can be coincide, or another cause of that fatigue after eating is a blood sugar crash. So if you have blood sugar dysregulation after a high starchy meal, you can feel really tired because of the rise in glucose, and then insulin gets reduced and then brings it down, and then you just feel that crash. So you notice it's after a meal. But the thing that distinguishes it is, one is a fatty meal that causes you to be tired, and the other one is a meal that is carbs, like high in carbs. That's how you distinguish the two. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you need someone like me to really look at it and be able to tell, because we're complex. It's not always clear, black and white. There's a lot of gray area. But in general, I just want to share with you, like, those are the things I look for when I assess signs and symptoms that the person is experiencing. So when you see the red bar on the right, that is an indicator that that bacteria is an opportunistic bacteria, meaning that at low number, they don't cause any problem. They are part of the microbiome and the ecosystem, and they serve their function. The bacteria that has the red bar on the left indicates those are significant, important bacteria that you want a lot of around. And so when they're deficient, that's when they cause problem, because you're missing their function and you're missing their protection. So that's why you want a lot of them. So I said earlier, Akkermansia mucinifera is the most important keystone species in the gut, because they help us clean up the mucus layer. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that not all of your tests will show up a little bit differently based on what bacteria are identified in your gut. So you may see bacteria that are not here shows up on your gut. That means your gut have some bacteria that are not common, right? So it's not bad, it's not good. It just depends on what is it. And so some of these you have to go in and search for them specifically, because some of them are not on not everyone has the same bacteria on them. So I look for patterns of overgrowth of gram-negative bacteria because of the lipopolysaccharide complex on their body. And then, so if you look at bacillus, so bacillus is a spore probiotic. So these are spore-forming bacteria, are also known as spore-based probiotics. These are native microorganisms to soil, so thus they have inhabited the human gut since the beginning of evolution. Because they are spore formers, they can survive stomach acid and have a better viability for germination in the small and large intestine. This is why I actually use a lot of bacillus or spore bacteria to treat, because they can survive the stomach acid, and when they get into the small intestine and the large intestine, they actually produce natural antibiotics that then will kill off other bacteria around them. So it's really good in conditions of bacteria overgrowth, right? And then, so the gut diversity, to maintain the balance, you need competition. That's why you need a variety of different bacteria. One will control the other population will control this population. So they all control each other, and they have like a delicate balance that they need to be at a certain level for your gut to be in harmony, right? So I love using spore biotics. I think they work a lot better than the other live probiotics. It is the main probiotics that I use. And you will see this in my supplement bundle recommendation as well. Certain species of bacillus produce vitamin K, particularly vitamin K2. Okay. And then they may increase butyrate and other short chain fatty acids. Not all of them do this, but some of them do. They also contribute to the health of the intestinal lining and may protect against pathogens. They have anti-inflammatory and immune system supporting benefits, and they have shown to be beneficial in leaky gut, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and cardiometabolic syndrome. So cholesterol, diabetes, right? High blood pressure. Those are cardiometabolic syndrome or obesity. Okay. So bacteroids are a group or family of bacteria that are gram-negative, non-spore forming bacillus. So they're rod shaped. Bacillus or just means they have a rod shape. And what what you need to know about this family is that they have an effect on the microbial balance, the integrity of the gut microbiome, and neuroimmune health. So high levels of these may result from reduced digestive capacity or constipation, meaning that if you can't digest certain food, that food comes and feed this population, and then they start to thrive. And that's what you need to know. Okay. And if these bacteroids, particularly Bacteroides fragilis, which isn't really tested on this because there is actually a pathogen, it's not part of the normal flora, they can, if they get out of the gut and travel to, due to leaky gut or ulcers, these bacteria can leak into your bloodstream, travel to another place in the body, and cause bacteremia, which is bacteria in the blood, and can form abscess in multiple body sites. So you can have abscess in the colon as well. So these are pretty dangerous bacteria. In general, you do not want a lot of them around. Okay, and then bifidobacterium. These guys make up between 0 to 95% of the gut microbiome in infancy. But as when we grow into adults, it represents about 1 to 15% of our microbiome. It is one of the first bacteria group to colonize the gut in newborn infants. Unfortunately, if the infant is born via C-section, this population do not get to colonize. So then and if you think about when the baby is born via C-section, it's get taken out, it doesn't get passed through the birth canal, and that's where you get exposure to these bacteria. So C-section babies end up not having a very robust microbiome. They actually have a lot of health issues as they grow because they don't have that exposure to these bacteria which colonize them, but instead they get first exposure to the bacteria that are in the hospital, in those sterile environment, which usually contains bacteria that are very hardy and resistant to antibiotics. I wish I had known this when I had my son. I actually knew, but I didn't push it hard enough to get my OB-GYN to rub my bacteria from the vaginal flora onto my baby, which I still regret to this day, but it is what it is, right? So bifidobacterium helps to balance the gut immune system, and it promotes the growth of Clostridia and protect against some pathogens. They thrive on a wide variety of fibers, oligosaccharides, and phytonutrients. So in general, lots of fruits and vegetables, variety of them. Responds really well to blueberries, pomegranate, apples, red wine, coffee, and cocoa or cacao. Okay. And then I mentioned earlier Akkermansia, so I want to go into it a little bit. So Akkermansia represents less than 1% to 3% of the microbiome. So you want, when you look at your stool analysis, you see this here, but in the first page of the test, you want the varicomicrobia to be about 0.1% to 3%. Obviously, the higher the better. Around close to 3% is much better. I don't see that very often. It is, like I said, this is not very common in modern human. Like most of us have a deficiency in Akkermansia mucinifera. Okay. they convert sugars into lactic acid. So they can also lower your fecal pH, making it more, it actually, when you have lower pH, you actually protect yourself from a lot of the bacteria that can't grow in an acidic environment. It contributes to the health of the intestinal lining by eating up all the mucus. It helps reduce inflammation and can contribute to the protection of from inflammatory bowel disease like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. Higher levels are associated with higher diversity of the microbiome. Okay, so now we're going to go into these Clostridia bacteria. So I'm just mentioning all the important groups first, okay? These guys represent 10 to about 50% or more of the microbiome. It is critical for intestinal lining health. It helps restrain or control inflammation, autoimmune disease, and it helps control harmful bacteria. It is also involved in metabolic regulation, so your metabolism, right? And then it's important producers of butyrate and secondary bile acids. So if you don't have a lot of Clostridia bacteria, you're not going to be able to produce a lot of butyrate. And it includes important groups of bacteria such as Faecalibacterium. So if you look down here, Faecalibacterium praunitzi is the second most important keystone species in the gut, per most of the research that we see and microbiome health experts. And even in my own practice, I definitely see the correlation between having high level of Faecalibacterium praunitzi and Akkermansia, reducing the amount of inflammation that I see in my patients. And those people usually have less clinical symptoms and they can recover a lot faster and better. These guys, so the Faecalibacterium roseburia and Eubacterium are, so Eubacterium is here, right? So you want a lot of these guys. And the other one I said was the roseburia, which is down here. So they group this in roseburia, right? In alphabetical order, which I actually don't like. They used to group this in like in their function, and somehow they changed that, and now it's like you have to go through each of them to understand the function of each bacteria. Now, this group also thrives on a high fiber diet. That's why you keep seeing high fiber, high fiber. It's just so many functions, right? And it feeds the microbiome. It also pulls cholesterol out of your liver. So 25 grams for women, 30 grams for men in general. And if you have a little bit higher, that also can help, but that may cause, depending on what type of fiber you consume, you may have too much, which can cause diarrhea. And if you don't drink enough water when you increase fiber, you can have constipation. So increase it slowly. So if you're just consuming 5 to 10 grams right now, don't go and just start like having 25 grams of fiber a day. You got to go up to 15, 17 and go slowly so that your body's used to it. Give it a couple of weeks for you to increase the fiber so you don't have the side effects. I know, just so many nuances, right, in how to take care of ourselves. And the important phytonutrients to improve Clostridia is berberine, clove, red grapes or red wine polyphenols, probiotics such as Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a beneficial yeast, Lactobacillus rhamnosus, Bifidobacterium adolescentes, and other Bifidobacterium can cross-feed Clostridia, meaning that they can help you grow this population. So Clostridium is a genus of Clostridia that houses several pathogens. So this is the group where you can have good bacteria and bad bacteria. So let me go back to what you see up here. So if you see Clostridia, that's the beneficial one, and the ones that I mentioned earlier, Faecalibacterium, roseburia, and Eubacterium are the good ones. But Clostridium is a subgroup. Think of them as under Clostridia. These guys are no good. When they overgrow, they can cause their waste products can negatively alter the brain and your nervous system, which have been implicated in autism, ADD, ADHD, OCD, seizures, psychosis, and depression. So this is the group of bacteria that I pay very close attention to in mood disorders and mental, like autism and brain dysfunction, brain fog, all right? And then pretty much those are the main things that you want to look at. Now, in the slides, you're going to see that there are other tests you could do to identify this, because this only represents part of the microbiome. You have to learn to not take everything as a because there's other variables. So there are other tests that you can run to get a better picture of how these guys are affecting your health. One of them is organic acid testing. I just want to mention that so you know that that's available. And a lot of functional medicine doctors use organic acid testing to identify bacteria overgrowth, yeast overgrowth, which is a little bit more accurate in measuring if those overgrowth is actually causing problems, because organic acid testing will test for waste products. How much waste products are being produced versus like over the in the urine sample. So in the way, it gives you a little bit more data point than just measuring what's in a small sample of your stool sample. Okay. Okay, that's all I wanted to say about that. And I talked about bacillus. Now let's talk about the sulfo vibrio. This is the gram-negative bacteria. So if you look here, these are the highlighted bacteria. I highlight these because I think these are fascinating. These are gram-negative bacteria that produces sulfate or sulfur, which means they breathe sulfate instead of O2, and they produce hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct. So I mentioned earlier, there are 3 types of SIBO: hydrogen gas, methane gas, and then hydrogen sulfide gas. This is excuse me. I've been dealing with something today. Excuse me. And this type of bacterial overgrowth, or this type of gas, is the most severe form. Hydrogen sulfide is known to inhibit the mitochondria and blocks oxygen carrying capacity of hemoglobin. So you can see that's really impactful, right? It can also increase toxicity of heavy metals by enhancing their absorption, by lowering the enzymes that eliminate them. So elevated levels of these guys can be seen with inadequate protein digestion, or when abundant dietary protein is consumed without sufficient dietary fiber. So ultimately, they feed on protein. When you eat protein, they break it down. So if you can't break down protein in the stomach, that excess protein will get to the gut and feed this population, and then they overgrow, and then they end up producing a lot of hydrogen sulfide. This is the gas that smells like rotten egg. Okay. And then if you need to consume enough fiber so that you can grow the other beneficial bacteria to balance out these guys overgrowth. Okay. So the archaic bacteria, they're not real bacteria, they're but for the sake of our conversation, let's consider them real bacteria. They are single-celled organism with a structure similar to bacteria, but they're not bacteria. They are obligate anaerobes, meaning that they cannot be exposed to air or oxygen. They're found as a commensal microorganism in the gut. Methanobacterialis, or Methanobrevibacter, is the most notable one, is the most studied one. And we don't understand everything about this archaea, the role of archaea in our gut, but because they produce methane gas, they ferment certain products produced by other microbes and turn them into methane gas and CO2. And the reduction of hydrogen in this process favors the growth of polysaccharide fermenting bacteria, leading to higher energy utilization of diet For example, higher levels of methanogenic archaea have been observed in overweight and obese individuals. So they interfere with our metabolism. They slow it down. And so a lot of people who have these overgrowth of Methanobrevibacter, they have a lot of issues with weight loss resistance or just obesity in general. And then the last group that we're going to discuss is proteobacteria. These guys represent between 2% to maybe 10% of the microbiome, and they're gram negative, and they usually produce pro-inflammatory LPS, which is the lipopolysaccharides. You don't want a lot of these guys around, okay? They have a lot of species that are known to cause diseases, and they thrive in inflammatory conditions. So some key opportunistic microbes to note is the proteobacteria, Collinsella. So if yours is, if you go through your list, and you can look in the slides as well, if you have Collinsella, Desulfo, Vibrio, Enterobacteriaceae, Helicobacter, Klebsiella, Methanobrevibacter, and Proteus. So Proteus bacteria are associated with, so Proteus bacteria usually is Proteus mirabilis. They are associated with UTIs, especially recurrent UTI, recurrent cystitis, or kidney infection. When there's an overgrowth of Proteus, they can translocate, meaning that they can translocate from the gut into the into the bladder, into the and it's through the tissues, because our gut is really close to the bladder. Usually that's where it goes first. And a lot of women deal with this. It's mainly because of the proximity between the anus and the vaginal, the vulva and the vaginal canal, right? And then where the urethra is as well. So yeah, I'm going to leave it as that. So typically I have a lot of women patients who have cystitis, and when you treat the gut microbiome, the recurrent cystitis goes away, especially very complex UTIs. These are the ones that you need to pay attention to. Okay, so we're going to, I'm going to go through and I'm going to show you. Actually, there's one more, lactobacillus. So, I used to think that lactobacillus was one of the most dominant bacteria group in the gut, but it's not. It actually represents only about 1% or less of the microbiome. It converts sugar into lactic acid. Actually, I think I already went over this, so please excuse me. We actually already went over this. But while we're here, I want to show you, this is the Methanobrevibacter smithii. When it's overgrowth, it's an indicator that you can produce a lot of methane gas. So typically these patients, it's harder to treat. But what I found that allows me to effectively treat this kind of SIBO is that when I treat parasites, people don't get relapse. But if you look at how SIBO is treated in functional medicine, 2/3 of patients will get relapse. Even when I used to just treat SIBO on its own, they would get relapse. Within a year, their symptoms would come back. But when I started treating parasites, they don't have relapse, which is so cool to me. But that tells me how significant parasites, like their presence, really dictate the control of our microbiome. And what I find interesting is that there's not a lot of studies on how parasites affect the microbiome. There are some, and I think there are very few doctors that really emphasize the importance of parasitic infection and having to treat them to restore microbiome balance, but it's just not talked about. It's not mentioned a lot. It's one of those things that are still out there, it seems, but it's one of those things that because I see so much results from this, that I'm starting to really, I'm trying to find all the evidence to put it together, to really put this out there so people can be more aware. Because I think as more people are aware that parasite is the biggest source of dysbiosis in the gut, like we would make I mean, like healthcare would be so much more effective. We would be able to solve so many chronic diseases by just treating the gut, but treating the parasites that live in our gut is so key. Okay. All right. I want to mention one more, a few more here. Streptococcus. So these guys, they are in the stomach usually. And when they overgrow, you can have a lot of acid reflux problem and ulcers problem. And then this Porphyromonas gingivalis, this one is a mouth microbiome bacteria. And because we swallow our saliva, they colonize our gut as well. But these guys, when they overgrow, is an indicator that you have gum disease, right? So this is something that you want to be able to pay attention to. Proteus mirabilis, I said earlier, UTI. And then Propionibacterium, these guys are associated with acne, right? And then Roseberia, they produce a lot of good waste products for us. All of these guys here are associated with heart health. So you want a lot of them around. In general, Staphylococcus bacteria and Streptococcus, they're more on our skin. They really shouldn't be a lot in our gut, but when they overgrow, they cause a lot of issues. Okay. And then these are all the bifidobacterium these are all good bacteria on this page in general. What you want is that they are in good range. Most people will have some that are deficient. And again, diversifying your diet is going to be the key in growing these population. Saccharomyces boulardii is a beneficial yeast. When you have yeast overgrowth from Candida, these guys will protect you. So when I start treating patient, the first probiotic I put them on is called Restore Flora. It has Saccharomyces boulardii and a Bacillus bacteria. They go in and they really start to just balance out the gut microbiome without doing much. So, and then that is also the probiotic that you want to use when you have to use antibiotics. You use it together, and then you continue the Restore Flora for about 6 to 8 weeks. I would definitely, continue it longer or change to another probiotic. But in general, you need to provide your gut with the right probiotic when you have to take antibiotics. And then now we're going to go into the gut pathogens. Okay. So there are 67 pathogenic gut microorganisms that were tested, including bacteria, fungi, viruses, parasites, worms, and 6 antibiotic resistance genes and phenotypes. So all of these bacteria here are bacteria that can cause mostly diarrhea. So when you have an infection like a stomach bug, you think that it's a stomach bug, usually they get in, you have diarrhea for a couple of days, and then it gets better, and then you never think about it again. But through time, that infection, because of their presence, they're going to start to change the landscape of your microbiome, and you're going to start to have certain population grow too much, and then dysbiosis start to arise because of that one infection. A lot of times, those infections will lead to SIBO. That's one of the most common causes of SIBO is post food poisoning episode. I think these are self-explanatory. Most of them, whichever one is positive, you can look it up, and I'm not going to go through all of their function and their information on that. It's just too much. But in general, they cause acute diarrhea, and then you end up having, sometimes the diarrhea will continue, but most of the time the diarrhea resolve. And then sometimes you can have constipation develop after the diarrhea resolve. But again, that is the effect it has on the microbiome that leads to dysfunction. So protozoa parasites are single cell parasites. They're really small. They're single cell, like liver flukes. And these, usually you pick them up in contaminated water, contaminated food, eggs. They produce eggs, right? And then you consume the eggs with produce that isn't washed very clean. Unfortunately, you can't wash everything that you consume like 100%, especially when you eat out. That's the biggest risk, because especially in third world countries, that's why third world countries focus more on parasites, because their awareness of parasites is really high because of just like the sanitary condition. Now in the US, because we think that we are so clean, we dismiss parasite altogether. Okay. And that's a big problem, I think, in healthcare. Because of the dismissing of parasites, we're mistreating them. And then the technology and the testing that we have for testing for parasites is actually just really bad. We can't, even this test, when you test for single cell parasites, they do show up. But when you test for parasites that are helminthes or worms, unless they're dead and they pass in the sample, which I only saw one person who tested positive for an actual parasite, or unless they're passing eggs, which I've seen maybe 3 times. But that's where I'm going to show you with the CBC, how you're going to look at your CBC to know if you have parasitic infection or not. So there's just other, like, and the eosinophil protein X, that's the other marker that you can look to see if there's a parasitic infection. So in general, we just don't have a good way of testing them. I just believe now, like just through my experience, everyone I've treated had parasites. So that's why for me, I'm going to come from, we got to deworm, period. And then we can treat all the dysbiosis, because when you do that, you're going to have long lasting results, and then symptoms do not relapse, and you just stay healthy longer. And then they also test for virus. So you can have a viral infection. Usually, these viral infections, you pick them up from kids, and you have acute diarrhea with fever. So a lot of times when you have, to distinguish a viral infection, is there's a fever with viral infection, and they tend to be a little shorter, right? Bacteria, you don't really see fever, but you just have a lot of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, and sometimes bloody stool. But in general, though, our immune system should be able to suppress and control any viral infection. But I've actually had quite a few patients who has a weak immune system, and then their viral infection in the gut persist, right? And then, so even if it's after years, and then once I treat them, literally all of their chronic symptoms go away. It's really amazing. And then there's fungus, right? The biggest one is Candida. That's the one that I've always seen. I haven't really seen any of the other fungal infection. And then when you have antibiotic resistance genes, that means that you should not take those antibiotics, because these bacteria, they're already producing an enzyme that either help them escape the antibiotic, or helps it prevent them from working. So that is your interpretation for the stool analysis. I hope that this helped, because I find this pretty hard to put together, because there's just so much information, and I didn't want to bore you guys, but I feel like I have to give you the boring material for you to really get what you need. But I also created some slides that's going to help you and guide you inside of like decoding this test. And you're going to be able to go to your live Q&A on Tuesday, and I will be able to answer all your questions. So I will see you in the next module or the next video.